welcome back everyone. It's 11 o'clock, so we are going to do our last presentation before lunch. It is Nolan Kowalchick and Charles Geddes. Charles is a research scientist in weed ecology and cropping systems at AAFC in Lethbridge, and Nolan is a technical sales manager at FMC Canada. Unfortunately, Nolan is unable to join us today to answer questions, but I'm certain that Charles will be able to handle all the questions that you can come up with. So I'll throw them at him after the presentation is over.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Charles Geddes, and I'm a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada based out of Lethbridge, Alberta. And I'm happy to be here today presenting or co-presenting with Nolan Kowalchick from FMC on herbicide layering and patch management. So I'll start off by providing a status of herbicide resistance in Canada and then focus more specifically on Alberta. Then I'll pass it over to Nolan, and Nolan will discuss the benefits of herbicide layering and also provide some relevant examples to Western Canada. And then I'll end off the presentation by talking about the benefits of integrating cultural management as well with a herbicide layering approach. So in Canada, we're sitting in third place, you could say, as far as the number of unique herbicide-resistant weed biotypes, following the United States and Australia. And in Canada, this is showing the timeline of discovery of these unique herbicide-resistant weed biotypes. And when I say unique herbicide-resistant weed biotype, I mean a weed species resistant to a herbicide mode of action, so that combination. And currently in Canada, we're sitting at about 75 or 76 unique herbicide-resistant weed biotypes. And what that looks like spread across the various provinces, you can see in the prairie region here, we're sitting at about the low to mid 20s as far as unique herbicide-resistant weed biotypes present within each prairie province. Then in Ontario, the number's a bit higher. And in the coastal regions, it's the numbers are a bit lower. And so what this reflects is one, potentially the selection pressure within the predominant cropping systems within these areas, but then also it represents the frequency and intensity with which fields are sampled for herbicide resistance as well. So focusing more specifically on Alberta now, this is showing the timeline of discovery of these unique herbicide-resistant weed biotypes. And also I'll note here that each dot shows the weed species that was discovered and the within brackets, the mode of action to which the weed species was confirmed resistant. Then in behind here, you can see these different colors indicate different surveys that have taken place over time. So the initial surveys kind of focused on herbicide resistance in wild oat more specifically, and some of these were more targeted surveys as well on certain areas or certain municipalities, for example. Then we move into the early 2000s, the prairie herbicide resistant weed surveys in their current format began. And so we've been through 3 rounds of these prairie herbicide resistant weed surveys in the last 20 years, and we're currently working on the 4th as well. Then in green here, these denote the post-harvest herbicide resistant weed surveys as well. And those post-harvest surveys focus more specifically on kochia and Russian thistle, just because the seed on these plants tend to be more viable after harvest than they are pre-harvest. So one of the projects that I have the opportunity to lead is the prairie herbicide resistant weed surveys. And these surveys were previously led by Hugh Becky out of AAFC in Saskatoon. And so these surveys cover 800 fields across the prairie region, so in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, over the course of about 4 years. And during that time, basically what we do is when we're surveying the fields, we visit the fields essentially right before harvest, and we survey those fields for visual patches of weeds that are present. So these would be weeds that were not controlled by the herbicides that were used within those crops. And when we see a weed patch, we sample seeds from that patch. We identify the patch to species as well. And those samples then come back to our research center where they go through our herbicide resistance screening pipeline that takes place both in the greenhouse and now more recently also in the lab. And basically in this pipeline, we're looking for different types of herbicide resistance to different herbicide modes of action. And the survey focuses more specifically on group 1 and 2 resistance, first of all, because these would be what we would consider the tier 1 herbicides as far as selection pressure for resistance, meaning that they can have greater selection pressure for resistance, and we see a greater frequency of resistance to these herbicides. So within Wild Oat here, we're showing the map from the previous round, or the third round of the prairie herbicide resistant weed surveys, showing all of the fields where Wild Oat was present before harvest. And in black, you can see the susceptible, or fields that had susceptible Wild Oat. In red are group 1 resistant Wild Oat, blue is group 2 resistant Wild Oat, and then green is multiple resistant Wild Oat to both group 1 and to group 2 herbicides. And you can see that essentially all of these types of resistance are fairly widespread across the prairie region, making Wild Oat one of the biggest herbicide resistant weed problems that prairie growers have to deal with. And when we're looking at the graphs here, this is just showing some of the data from the previous 3 rounds of the surveys, documenting the increase in group 1 resistant Wild Oat over time. So here we're looking at the percentage of fields with group 1 resistant Wild Oat as a percentage of the fields where Wild Oat was collected and tested. So essentially here in the last round of surveys, over half of the fields where Wild Oat was tested were confirmed with group 1 resistant Wild Oat. Then looking at group 2 resistance as well, you can see there was almost a lag in the increase in group 2 resistance. And the main reason for this is because farmers were focusing, or they used more group 1 herbicides for Wild Oat management. But once they realized that they had selected for group 1 resistant Wild Oat, then their herbicide management program shifted more toward focusing on group 2 herbicides to manage those group 1 resistant biotypes. And what essentially happens is that focuses the selection pressure on a new herbicide mode of action. And then you end up with multiple resistant Wild Oat to group 1 and 2. And you can see that same sort of a pattern here with the multiple herbicide resistant Wild Oat as well. So another unique part about this survey is that when we're in the field surveying, we're documenting the area in which the patches that are sampled infest. And so those data follow these samples through the herbicide resistance screening pipeline. And once the sample is confirmed resistant, then we can back calculate to the area of the field which is infested with herbicide resistant weeds. And so based on the infested area, so these would be the areas where the patches are present within fields, about 35% of the farmland cropped annual crops in the prairie region contain at least one herbicide resistant weed biotype. And I also show the field area here, or calculated based on field area, because generally when farmers are applying herbicides, they're applying a blanket herbicide to the entire field rather than just focusing on patch management, which is the difference here between 35% of the farmland and 59%. Also with this survey, we use a grower management questionnaire to collect information on management practices and also information on the perceived cost of weed resistance as well. This is a farmer reported figure that would include the impact of a herbicide resistant weed, both on a decline in crop yield and then also the additional cost to manage that biotype as well. In the previous round of surveys documented that the cost of a herbicide resistant weed biotype present in a field is about $13 per acre. And so this can be used to determine the cost of herbicide-resistant weeds as well. And the most recent estimate is that herbicide-resistant weeds cost prairie farmers about $530 million annually, which does equate to a fairly large impact on the prairie and Canadian agricultural sector. So another herbicide-resistant weed that has increased as of recent is herbicide-resistant kochia. And so the story for kochia is that back in the late 80s, group 2 resistance was discovered, and over the course of 20 years, or about 2 decades, that type of resistance spread to the point where we consider all kochia populations found in the prairies group 2 resistant, to the point where it's not even worth testing for resistance anymore. Then in 2011, the first cases of glyphosate-resistant kochia were found in southern Alberta, and a subsequent survey of Alberta in 2012 identified that about 5% of the populations in the province at the time contained glyphosate-resistant biotypes. And this survey was repeated 5 years later, and after only 5 years, glyphosate resistance had spread from 5% of the populations to now 50% of the populations. So this is a very rapid spread of herbicide resistance. And then also in 2017, dicamba resistance was documented as well in about 18% of those populations. So that made about 10% of the populations triple resistant to group 2 herbicides, as well as group 4 and group 9. And of course, triple resistant kochia can limit the herbicide options that are available for a chemical management program, and also a herbicide layering approach. The next survey of Alberta is scheduled for this growing season in 2021, and it will be really interesting to see what the herbicide resistance landscape looks like within kochia populations in the province. So to focus more in on the synthetic auxin resistance, so I mentioned dicamba resistance was found in Alberta in 2017, which is shown by the map here. And interestingly, the dicamba resistance was found more so in southern Alberta compared with some of the samples that were up either almost equivalent or north of Calgary. Then some of our more recent research has focused on also screening these samples with fluroxypyr as well, which is another synthetic auxin herbicide. And what we wanted to do was document whether the populations were broadly cross-resistant to multiple synthetic auxins, dicamba and fluroxypyr being among the synthetic auxin active ingredients that are used to the greatest extent in small grain cereal crops for kochia management. And so what we found in our additional screening was that about 13% of the populations in 2017 were fluroxypyr resistant, but interestingly, only 4% of the populations actually overlapped, meaning that many of the populations were actually resistant to either dicamba or fluroxypyr, but only 4% of the populations had both biotypes present. Meaning that if you have one or the other, so for example, if you have dicamba resistant kochia, fluroxypyr might actually be a viable option to help manage those biotypes, and vice versa as well. Then here just showing another map on fluroxypyr resistance, and I mentioned that the dicamba resistant populations were kind of more in the southern part of the province, whereas the fluroxypyr resistant populations were actually almost more on the western part of the province. And you can see here reporting on the frequency with which we actually confirmed a positive case of resistance. Here, these frequencies are much greater sort of in this corridor between Lethbridge and Calgary compared with the other parts of the province. So I focused in on a couple of the really big problems that we have here as far as herbicide-resistant weeds on the prairies, but also there are several other herbicide-resistant weed biotypes present in Alberta, many of them resistant to group 1 or 2 herbicides, but others that also have additional resistance as well. But I will leave it here, and from here, actually, first of all, I wanted to mention of course, herbicide resistance is important, especially when we're talking about various herbicide sites of action. And you can see this is showing the timeline of release of new herbicide sites of action over time. And what I wanted to show with this, first of all, it looks like that multiple herbicide modes of action have been released. But also when you look at the timeline here, it essentially stops in the late 80s. And in the past 3 decades, we really have not seen a new herbicide mode of action released that is or would be used in prairie agriculture. So we're seeing an increase in the number of herbicide-resistant weed biotypes, but a stagnation in the release of new herbicide modes of action available for their management, meaning that we need to come up with new ways to help manage these biotypes and also mitigate the selection for new types of herbicide resistance. So from here, I'll pass it off to Nolan, and Nolan will talk about the benefits of taking a layering approach in a herbicide strategy.
Hello, my name is Nolan Kowalchick, and I'm the FMC Technical Sales Manager covering off Alberta and Northern Saskatchewan. Today I'm going to talk to you about weed resistance management, more specifically about herbicide layering. When thinking about a weed resistance management strategy, there are no silver bullets or strategies that will work for all. However, proactive planning will allow one to develop a practical working strategy for helping to prevent herbicide resistance from developing or being able to actively manage it if it is already developed. So when developing a weed resistance management strategy, it is important to consider and examine the following components. What weeds are you targeting? Narrowleaf hawksbeard, dandelion, kochia, cleavers, wild oats. And knowing this allows you to figure out what products and what modes of action or herbicide group could potentially be used to provide the highest efficacy. Next is, application timing. What application timing will control your target weeds? Pre-emergent, in-crop, pre-harvest, post-harvest. Some groups can only be used pre-seed, pre-emergent, like groups 3 or 8, whereas utilizing group 2 for fall perennial weed control may be more advantageous. What are your herbicide choices based on crop rotation? And are there better crop rotations that open up modes of action better suited to control these target weeds in question? Some crops like cereals and canola have more options and more products and modes of action available. Lentils only have 2 to 3 herbicide groups per application timing. Peas open up the highly efficacious group 14 soil applied mode of action to control group 2, 4, 9, and resistant kochia. So all factors to keep in mind. And also, last but not least, is do you have efficacious modes of action providing high control of resistant weeds? If you're targeting a group 2 resistant weed, like kochia, utilizing a group 14 and 15 mode of action may be a wise choice while still using the group 2 on other problem perennial weeds within the same field, like narrowleaf hawksbeard or dandelion. It's answers to these areas which are critical in the approach you choose to manage resistance. Are non-chemical or cultural management strategies going to be employed, or will it be a combination of both cultural tools along with a herbicide use strategy? So once you've developed your weed resistance management strategy, it's important to devise a herbicide use strategy. And the key components, or I like to call them the key pillars of a herbicide use strategy, are limit the applications of single mode of action, limit the use of the same herbicide or tank mix repeatedly, use effective modes of action for the tank mix, and implement herbicide layering strategies. The three pillars of the herbicide use strategy are somewhat self-explanatory. However, what is herbicide layering? Well, it is using effective multiple active ingredients and herbicide groups to control the same weed, however, at different application timings. Using soil applied products to control weeds while they are emerging, and utilizing tank mix strategies to control already emerged weeds. In this case, you have a group 14 and 15 providing extended control of kochia. Other cases like carfentrazone as a group 14 will help to target emerged weeds in conjunction with glyphosate. Ensure your pre-seed and in-crop herbicide applications include different chemical groups. This will ensure that you do not select for resistance to another group or increase selection pressure to a group that you already may have resistant concerns to. And so this chart just kind of depicts, a variety of different herbicide modes of action that you can pick depending on the weed target in question. And as well, use as many different herbicide groups as possible. 4 would be great. Using a strong pre-seed herbicide is key. Something with extended control helps to reduce the resistant weed seed populations and reduces overall weed pressure and density for the in-crop herbicide. One key area of herbicide layering is to ensure that you are considering the weeds that you're targeting. Some of the key early germinating weeds each spring tend to be cleavers, downy brome, kochia, foxtail barley, lamb's quarters, and wild mustard. So utilizing an extended control herbicide layering product will be key in controlling these early flushes, not only reducing weed pressure for the in-crop, but allowing one to pick an in-crop that is better suited for what new weeds may emerge. Depending on the length of the extended control, you may still gain some activity of some of the later germinating weeds, green and yellow foxtail, barnyard grass, redroot pigweed, wild oats, or you can pick your next in-crop product to target these specific later germinating weeds. When it comes to perennials, winter annuals like dandelions, stinkweed, narrowleaf hawksbeard, the opportunity really opens up to use effective products on these and other perennials and winter annuals. In-crop or post-harvest applications of group 2 herbicides are highly efficacious on perennials and winter annuals.
Here is a great example on implementing a herbicide layering strategy in front of field peas. The left side is untreated and, as you can see, is very populated with Russian thistle and kochia. On the right-hand side, a group 3 soil-applied granular was applied trifluralin on October 28th of 2020, and then a group 14 15 product, sulfentrazone and pyroxasulfone, was applied in the spring of 2021, April 28th of 2021. So 30 days after the application of the spring products, you can see, as compared to the untreated on the left-hand side, the fall applied group 3 and the spring applied group 14 and Group 15 extended control herbicide layers did an excellent job on both the Russian thistle and the kochia, as depicted on the right-hand side. The Group 3 is rated as control on Russian thistle, while the Group 14 and 15 combination modes of action are rated as control of kochia.
I will now take you to another plot that my colleague Jordan Brisbaugh, Extended Weed Control Marketing Manager, will discuss on a trial that we had in Hanley, Saskatchewan.
I'm going to take you inside another really key plot here at preschool. What you see behind is really the full package of herbicide layering. You're going to see a Group 3 granular, which is applied early in the spring, and it is coupled with a Group 14 broadleaf and a Group 15, which has both grassy and broadleaf activity, as well as our popular Group 9 that we spray all over Western Canada. So come with me inside the plot and I'll show you what we see here. As you can see, the crop we've planted here is field peas. And you can look inside this area here and you can see that there are some smaller weeds coming up, and that's okay because we're at in-crop season. What that package of products has done, we've really built the layers up that are targeting all these key weeds. And now there's a low population as well as smaller weeds. Field peas has a really limited options as far as in-crop spraying is concerned. So what we have now is a really easy to control smaller population as a result of layering all those products together.
Thanks, Jordan. So in project trials that were conducted in the fall of 2019 and the spring of 2020, focusing on herbicide management strategies for weed control in lentils, the results found that a single in-crop herbicide application or just spring-applied burn-off herbicide treatments were least effective in controlling wild mustard, kochia, and volunteer canola. The most effective weed management strategy in lentils was when a fall-applied extended weed control herbicide was used in combination with a spring-applied burn-off herbicide combination. Overall, this study confirmed herbicide layering can be an essential strategy to control these species for better weed management and greater crop yields in lentils. Here was a trial completed in 2015 looking at ways to control glyphosate-resistant kochia, done by Charles Geddes and others with published results in 2021. Of the 20 treatments, the 3 most effective herbicide treatments were sulfentrazone applied pre-emergence with 99% control of glyphosate-resistant kochia, post-emergent phylloxipir bromoxynil 2,4-D applied post-emergent, achieving 94% control, and pyrosulfatol and bromoxynil post-emergent, achieving 92% control. So this is a good example of how both herbicide layering and effective modes of action can be highly efficacious. However, another opportunity from this work is to look at the application of the herbicide layering product, the sulfentrazone, in conjunction with an in-crop application of the post-emergent phylloxipir bromoxynil 2,4-D or pyrosulfatol plus bromoxynil to achieve the greatest, highest efficacy, moving that kochia, that resistant kochia control up to, close to or 100% control. Here's a study completed by Ken Sapsford through the University of Saskatchewan, looking at different methods of trying to control Group 2 resistant cleavers in soils greater than 6% organic matter. In this study, he looked at edge, heat, and authority applied as pre's alone, so edge, heat, and authority, as depicted by the first set of light blue rectangles. Although authority offered, the highest percentage of weed control out of the 3, in each case, the control was just not satisfactory. When he looked at using the pre in combination with an in-crop application, as depicted by the set of red rectangles. Edge followed by Viper, heat followed by Viper, authority, high rate followed by Viper. The control increased significantly over the single pre-applications alone. This is another great example of how utilizing soil-applied herbicide layering actives in conjunction with the in-crop can help increase efficacy of troublesome resistant weeds. So now is the time to put the concept of herbicide layering and tank mixing to work. Let's say we are in an area where we are targeting group 2 and 9 resistant kochia in a brown soil zone. Here is a good example of how you can utilize altering modes of action with varied crop rotations to manage resistant kochia. So here we are in year 1 with Invigor canola. It opens up the use of group 14 carfentrazone, group 6 bromoxynil, group 9 glyphosate pre-seed, in crop, your group 10, plus a group 1 for the grass component. And then as a pre-harvest application, a group 14 in conjunction with glyphosate is a group 9. And then in this case, the post-harvest application with group 3 triolate and group 8 trifluralin. So as you can see, you have a number of different effective modes of action targeting kochia. In year 2, we have a durum wheat crop. You have the ability now to utilize a herbicide layering group 14 sulfentrazone to achieve extended control of the kochia, plus group 9 glyphosate, and an in-crop utilizing a group 2 multi-mode of action, thifensulfuron and tribenuron combination, plus group 4 phylloxipir, targeting the resistant kochia. In year 3, we plant lentils. This opens up the use of carfentrazone plus glyphosate and opens up the use of a herbicide layering group 15 pyroxasulfone to achieve extended activity on kochia. A group 2 and a group 1 can be used for in-crop weed management. And it's in this year, a post-harvest application can be completed for winter annuals, let's say, like narrow-leaf hawksbeard, utilizing a group 2 with tribenuron, a group 4 with dicamba, a group 14 with carfentrazone, and a group 9 with glyphosate being used to provide multi-modes of action to control weed pressure. And in year 4, because of the great post-harvest control we were able to achieve at the end of year 3, and with a cool spring in year 4, the grower decides to just do a glyphosate only burn off. And then with the increased weed growth, it begins to rain more, warms up, there's increased weed growth. It's important now to throw a lot of different modes of action to tackle this increased weed growth, using multi-modes of action to get the best weed control. Using products like phylloxipir, having a phylloxipir mode of action, group 4, a group 6 with the bromoxynil, and a group 27 with the pyrosulfatol, and then a pre-harvest application with the glyphosate. So as you can see in this example, it's kind of using many different modes of action sequentially in a pre-seed, an in-crop, pre-harvest or post-harvest combination to be able to get effective control of kochia at all these different application timings where possible. So in summary, or to summarize our weed resistance management discussion and the importance of herbicide layering, it really starts with, developing a weed resistance management strategy. What weeds are involved? What timing controls these weeds best? Are there cropping rotations that open up herbicide groups that better control these target weeds? And lastly, are there effective modes of action being used to control target weeds or potentially resistant weed targets? You know, having a herbicide use strategy in place and try to adopt as many of the 4 key pillars as possible. Limit the applications of a single mode of action, limit the use of the same herbicide or tank mix repeatedly, use effective modes of action for the tank mix, and implement herbicide layering strategies. And utilizing herbicide layering and using effective multiple active ingredients and herbicide groups to control the same weed, however, at different application timings. There's no silver bullet answer or strategy that will work for all. However, proactive planning will allow one to develop a practical working strategy for helping to prevent herbicide resistance from developing or being able to actively manage it if it has already developed. That concludes our discussion today. Thanks for joining me.
Okay, thanks, Nolan. So from here, what I wanted to talk about was the benefits of integrating cultural management in with a herbicide layering approach. First of all, I'm going to focus on one of our experiments that we have here in Lethbridge, Alberta, that is focusing on a wheat, canola, wheat, lentil crop rotation. And in this particular experiment, we're looking at trying to manage herbicide-resistant kochia within that rotation. So we've actually planted glyphosate-resistant kochia into the plots at the beginning of the experiment, and then basically our challenge is to try and manage the herbicide-resistant weed using both a chemical management program, but then also adding in cultural management to help get an additional edge. So what the other sort of thing that we wanted to consider, because at the time of designing this particular experiment, we knew that that dicamba-resistant kochia was discovered in Alberta. So even though we didn't plant oxinic-resistant kochia into the experiment, we took the approach where we limited the use of oxinic herbicides with sort of the assumption that those herbicides would be less available for control of these biotypes in the future. So here what I'm showing is the herbicide program. And again, similar to Nolan, I've separated the herbicide use out into various categories. So starting off in the wheat phase, so we used a pre-plant application of glyphosate and carfentrazone, so a group 9 and a group 14. Then the in-crop application or the post-emergence application was a combination of both bromoxynil and pyrosulfatol. So a group 6 and a 27, which both would have activity on kochia. Then in the fall, we applied ethylfluralin to help get some extended control of the herbicide-resistant kochia. And in the canola, the subsequent spring, we just used glyphosate as our pre-plant. This was Liberty Link canola, so we applied glufosinate in crop. And glufosinate tends to have fairly good activity on kochia when it's timed appropriately. And from there, we moved into the wheat phase again, where we used glyphosate and carfentrazone pre-plant, and then a different herbicide, which included both MCPA and bromoxynil post-emergence. So again, relying a bit more on the photosystem 2 inhibitor, bromoxynil, or the group 6 here. Then moving into lentil, we used a combination of glyphosate being a group 9, as well as saflufenicil being a group 14, and pyroxasulfone being a group 15 for our kochia control pre-plant. And then this provided a bit of residual and extended control moving into into crop growth, where essentially in lentil we were limited to the use of a group 2 herbicide or a Mazamox, which because we have group 2 resistant kochia, or essentially all kochia populations on the prairies are considered resistant to group 2, we would not see complete control with that post-emergence herbicide application, which is why it's important to add in the other modes of action pre-plant. So the other unique thing about this, taking this approach and this experiment, was that we had all of these phases present within every year. And then in addition, we also had this entire rotation using either wide row spacing versus narrow row spacing, as well as either seeding these crops at recommended densities versus double the recommended densities. And so this is just taking a few photos of the different crops, or the rotation here. And on the top, I just have so these would have received the same herbicide as on the bottom. The only difference being on the top, we have the wide row spacing and recommended seeding densities versus the bottom, where we would have narrower row spacing and double the recommended seeding densities. And you can see just by comparing these plots visually, adding in these cultural management tools in the form of decreasing row spacing and increasing the crop seeding rate in order to promote more of a competitive crop and competitive environment, you can see visually a reduction in kochia within those plots. So to focus more on some of the data now, you can see here we're showing kochia biomass measured throughout the first 3 years of this experiment. So the experiment started in 2018, this is a pretty busy figure here, but what I just wanted to point out here is that we have the wheat, canola, wheat, lentil rotation, and then separated by a 1x or recommended density versus double the recommended density, then either wide row or narrow row. So essentially each chunk of 4 is a different rotation with different cultural management tools. But what I wanted to point out overall here, so first of all, the interaction of all of these factors, so row spacing, density, crop rotation phase, as well as year. So it was not significant, but some of the main effects were actually significant, making the story a bit more simple. But what I wanted to point out here visually, first of all, is that focusing on the more competitive rotation, where we have narrower row spacings and double the recommended densities, you can see that the kochia biomass, essentially throughout all of the phases and years, tends to be much lower compared with a less competitive environment, either a lower seeding density or wider row spacing as well. So to focus in more on the effects that were significant here. So first of all, crop rotation phase by year. And here you can see just in general, the trend being that we're seeing greater kochia biomass in lentil, which makes sense because the group 2 herbicide and Mazamox used in lentil would have less efficacy for control of the herbicide resistant kochia. Then focusing on crop density now, and again, each bar is a different year from sampling the various phases of the rotation. And you can see overall in the first 2 years, so 2018, 2019, crop density did not have an effect. But in 2020, crop density actually did have a fairly significant effect, where there was much reduced kochia biomass when we used higher crop seeding rates. So we saw a reduction in 2020 by about 74%. So a 74% reduction in kochia biomass. Then focusing on row spacing, and here you will see that it's not separated by year, because this was an effect that was observed throughout all of the years, and as well as all of the crop rotation phases. So in each of those crops that are grown in the rotation, meaning that this effect was quite consistent throughout all of the years and all of the crops. And you can see growing the crops at a wide row spacing versus a narrow row spacing, we have a reduction by about 60% in kochia biomass. And again, I'll mention that throughout these rotations, we're trying to optimize our herbicide layering approach, but then the additional edge here is adding in this cultural management on top, where we're really seeing almost better performance of those herbicides, and then also competition with the kochia plants that remained unmanaged. So focusing on crop yield now, we saw an impact of crop rotation phase, which is to be expected when we're comparing various different crops. But then also focusing on row spacing, we did see an impact of row spacing in 2018, and you'll notice that I don't have the 2020 data here yet. But in 2018, we did see an impact where when herbicide-resistant kochia was present, planting the crop in narrower rows actually did result in a 26% increase in crop yield overall. So this would be among all of the various crops and crop rotation phases. So here's a different study now. So this is focusing on one of our greenhouse experiments conducted by an undergrad student in our program in 2019. And this particular experiment is called a dose response, where we subject, here we have 3 different kochia populations to varying doses of a herbicide. And here we're focusing on fluroxypyr as the herbicide. And so we have 3 different populations. We knew that this population was already confirmed resistant to fluroxypyr, and this population was perhaps resistant, and we knew that the Lethbridge population here was a susceptible population. But in addition to a standard dose response experiment, which would be conducted in the absence of a crop, we also added in varying densities of the crop as well, trying to promote that competitive environment and seeing if there's any synergy when we're adding in competition as well. And you can see here in the response of the populations to the herbicide based on biomass, you can see that and this would be kochia biomass, obviously, and you can see that under no competition, there's obviously much greater kochia biomass. Adding in that competition, you can see even with the resistant biotype, how much adding in crop competition actually helps to decrease the biomass regardless of whatever rate of the herbicide that you're applying. And so what we do with a dose response experiment, and also this is the experiment that's used to confirm resistance in many cases, is that we pull out the dose that causes a 50% reduction in the parameter that we're looking at, in this case biomass, and we compare the dose of the herbicides that's required for that level of control among multiple populations to confirm whether a population is resistant compared with our known susceptible controls. And so here what we're looking at are these values. So here we're focusing on the metric being plant survival. And so it would be called an LD50 or a lethal dose of causing 50% mortality in the population. And again, we're focusing in this same experiment on the 3 different kochia populations. The Vulcan population and Lethbridge population were essentially susceptible, and we did not see that much of an impact of wheat plant density on the LD50 values. But then focusing on our known resistant population, Rocky View, you can see that actually adding in crop competition here on the x-axis, you can see a significant decline in the LD50 values, meaning that adding in crop competition is actually quite beneficial when we're talking about trying to compete with a herbicide-resistant weed, because it's essentially improving the performance of the herbicide and decreasing the amount of the herbicide that's actually required to control resistant weed biotype. And here, this is showing the exact same thing, but with a different metric, which would be visible control 4 weeks after the herbicide was applied. So of course, we've talked about taking a herbicide layering approach. We've talked about adding in cultural management. I think another really important component is patch management as well. And so here just showing a patch of kochia in a wheat field. Many weeds are quite patchy, where you'll see dense patches where the weed is very competitive compared with other parts of the field where the weed is present at a lower density or not as competitive and likely not impacting yield as much either. And so some of our research wanted to focus on these dense patches and what do we do with them. You'll see driving through the prairies in fields that are infested with kochia, you'll often see a picture like this where the crop is harvested around sort of a green kochia patch. And the question is, what do you do with those patches that are essentially too green to go through the combine? And also, how can you manage them so those patches won't come back in subsequent years? So in order to do this, we wanted to focus on seed production, because essentially seed entering the soil seed bank is going to be the source from which the population establishes in subsequent years. And we wanted to answer a few questions related to seed production. So how late can this species emerge and produce viable seed before the end of the growing season, but then also in those patches, when does the seed actually become viable as well? Because we want to be trying to manage them before seed viability. So here we're showing the impact of timing of emergence on kochia seed production. So here we have the x-axis is in thermal time or growing degree days, and the y-axis is percent viable seed production or percent of the maximum. And here we're just showing 2 different site years and then the mean among those site years as well. And what this is showing is that kochia can actually emerge fairly late in the growing season and still produce viable seed. Here showing about 2,000 growing degree days being on average compared with climate normals, showing a date of about August 13th, meaning that kochia can emerge up to almost mid-August and still produce viable seed. Then the other part of the study that we're interested in here is, when does the seed on the plant actually become viable as well? And here we're just showing, again, information from 2 site years, again in Lethbridge in 2018 and 2019. And this is showing that about that same time period is when we start to see seed become viable on the plants as well. So after about mid-August, we're starting to see a fairly rapid increase in viable seed production on kochia plants. The really interesting part, though, is when you put these 2 different concepts together, you can see that throughout the growing season, there's a clear period where kochia plants, it's basically enough of the population has emerged and any new emerging plants will not be able to produce viable seed after that time point, but then also seed production has not actually started yet as well. So this is identifying essentially a period where for optimal management of these patches, somewhere in sort of mid-August being the time where if we came in and managed those patches in mid-August, or say cut those patches and maybe perhaps also treated the regrowth with a herbicide, that would go a long way to preventing the introduction of seed back into the soil seed bank. Which is really important with a weed species like kochia that has very short seed longevity in the soil seed bank. Because if you can prevent seed entry or seed production and return to the soil seed bank for a few years in a row, that can go a long way to reducing these problem areas within fields. Some of our new research also is focusing on the impact of pre versus post-harvest herbicides on this period as well. And the preliminary results are showing that we can almost extend this period a bit later in the growing season as well, if we decide to use either a pre or a post-harvest herbicide. But those are preliminary results at this point. So in conclusion, what I wanted to have as the take-home messages here are, first of all, herbicide-resistant weeds can have a large impact on farms in Alberta. And then also herbicide layering can be a very effective approach for herbicide-resistant weed management, and also as one component of an integrated weed management program. We tend to see additive management, either additive or synergistic management, when we're adding cultural weed management in with an optimal herbicide program as well. So adding in cultural management can actually go a long way when we're talking about herbicide-resistant weed management. And finally, in order to manage some of these problematic weeds, so we're seeing multiple herbicide resistance show up in a few different weed species on the prairies. And in order to manage them effectively, we now need to focus on the biology and ecology of those weeds and come up with targeted management strategies, because the number of herbicides that we have to manage these biotypes are dwindling. And we need to come up with more creative approaches to help manage these biotypes effectively. So with that said, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I'd also like to thank our various co-investigators and staff that work on our kosher research, and also the various funders that have funded our kosher research within our research program as well. So thanks very much for listening.
All right, Charles, thank you so much for that interesting presentation, and for you and Nolan taking the time to put that together for us. Any questions from the audience, you can now throw them at Charles. Like I said earlier, raise your hand, turn your camera on, or type it into the chat. We'll open it up. Nobody has questions yet. All right, I'll start with one. Charles, if you're to guess what the 2021 kochia survey is going to show, what are you thinking might look like this year?
Yeah, I think we kind of know what it's probably going to look like already. I think I'm expecting to see greater incidence of both glyphosate and oxinic resistance in kochia. I think since the last survey was done, we've had quite a few years that have been really beneficial, you could say, for kochia growth, and it's a problem that's persisted through these last few years anyway. So I think that we're going to see the landscape of resistance showing increased incidence, unfortunately.
I think, yeah, that's not a surprise to anybody. Ken, did you have a question, or Scott?
If nobody else is going to put any questions in, I was wondering if there's any thoughts on integrating some tillage back into systems to control some of these weeds, like either inter-row tillage or instead of using pre-seed chemicals, maybe just a very quick tillage to wipe out the seedlings, or even I know in organic they talk about the white thread stage where you don't even see the weeds, but a very light tillage can be enough to disrupt them. So any thoughts on that?
I think that's a really excellent question. Sorry, I got a dog with me in the background here. I think that's a really good question, and I know research specifically focused on kochia and some other weeds as well has shown that the tillage actually can be a beneficial tool for helping with kochia management, and I think that there might be a place there as far as using, say, the occasional tillage pass, or maybe using tillage in as a patch management strategy or something like that in the really problematic areas, right? But there's obviously a balance as well, sort of looking at the beneficial aspect of potentially using tillage for weed control, and then also looking at what impact would that have on soil health, right? And I think that there are a few studies out there looking at the impact of sort of the occasional tillage pass, say maybe once every 4 years or something like that, and what impact that would have on soil health. And I think we're sort of really eager to sort of see if there is a negative impact of including something like that on occasion, right? But obviously I think that it's not a complete solution, but it could be one part of the answer, I think.
Yeah, that's what I see. I definitely don't see going back to large scale tillage, but just as one of the strategies.
Yeah, for sure. And I know in some of our research plot land as well, after we do this kochia research, it tends to be pretty infested with herbicide resistant kochia. And one of the ways that we try and get that problem under control again after we do the research is actually just till it once and apply a residual pre-seed herbicide, something like sulfentrazone, and that at least gives us a bit of an edge to help get a crop established to compete with the kochia in those areas.
Okay, Michelle, you have your hand up. Did you have a question for Charles?
Yeah, it's maybe I'm not as familiar with kochia management either, but I'm just curious about the patch approach. I like the idea. I help occasionally on the family farm with some patch management of chamomile. So I wondered with kochia, if you were to go in and say mow or cut down the plant, if you actually have to remove the plant as well. Because with chamomile, of course, we remove it because a lot of those seeds will remain viable and you kind of re-inoculate. But I wonder with the kochia, if you could just mow it or work it in, if it could become biomass and not a seed population. I'm not sure if that would work.
Yeah, I think the answer probably isn't as straightforward as you'd like, but my answer would say it depends on the timing with which you'd be coming in and managing, right? So some of our recent research is actually looking at the timing of coming in and cutting those patches, right? And in that study, we're removing the biomass that we're cutting off. So it's hard to say. I have noted in some weed species that if you do cut them and the seeds, say, are just starting to mature, they'll actually mature on the plant after they're cut off, which will then result in some entry of the seed into the soil seed bank. I think one potential option would be to treat that patch with a pre-harvest herbicide as well. That could maybe help prevent some of those viable seeds from maturing after the fact. But also what we're seeing is depending on the timing that you're cutting, those patches can regrow as well, right? So if you're cutting a kochia patch or likely mowing a kochia patch as well, while it's still vegetative, it will actually come back and put all of its energy into producing as much seed as possible before the end of the growing season, right? But if you cut the patch early and then apply a post-harvest herbicide, it tends to actually prevent that regrowth as well.
Great, thanks.
You're going to let me sneak one in, Jamie, even though it's lunchtime?
Yeah, you got it.
Hey, Charles, thanks for the presentation and thanks for working with us on the patch management side of things. I found this slide interesting that you showed on the seed viability and your sort of target window. Unfortunately, that target window is when it's sort of dry and hot and almost impossible to kill anything. So I don't know, like, are we allowed to create strategies that would deal with a patch like that would maybe say up rates of herbicides or a different type of herbicide that would actually work on a plant that's that hardy?
Yeah, it's one observation with kochia, and I'm sure several on the call have observed this as well, is basically once it gets past a certain stage, there's no controlling it completely, right, with a herbicide. So I'll come back to that same study that we're looking at, sort of the timing of coming in and cutting those patches integrated with various herbicide applications as well. And I think the point in this case, so basically in those dense patches, I mean, you're not going to be profiting off the crop in that area, obviously, right? So it's basically looking at kind of what combination of control approaches can you use to prevent the seed from getting back into the soil seed bank, and that research is showing that basically it's all about timing when you come in and manage those patches, right? You might not be visually seeing complete control, but it's all about just trying to prevent the seed production on those plants, if that makes sense. As far as higher rates, that's something that I probably wouldn't advocate, but I would recommend following basically the herbicide labels in those cases. But I do think that combining the herbicide with something like cutting the patch or removing that biomass, potentially even using it as an animal feed as well, right? I think that's probably the way to go in my mind.
Thanks, Charles. I did also hear that the kochia is bad this year and that it's even creeping in on irrigation now too.
Yeah, that it's certainly a problem on dry land, but then also can be a problem on irrigation as well, especially if the crop is say a glyphosate resistant sugar beet or something like that, right? There's pretty few options as far as management in those cases, unfortunately.
All right. Well, thank you, Charles, and thank you all for the questions. I want you to encourage you to continue asking questions. We are going to break for lunch now. Join us back here at 1 p.m. sharp. We're going to start